Lakes are places of peace, at least that's what they say. The calm surface of the water, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind, the feeling of being isolated from the rest of the world. But when night falls, that isolation becomes a problem. Because when the silence is absolute, any unusual sound seems like a warning, a whisper, a sign that you are not alone. That's exactly what happened to Lucas. He had never believed in those stories, until that night. The air inside the house was heavy and damp. Outside, the lake stretched out like a black mirror, reflecting nothing but the moon and the void of the night. Everything seemed calm, until he woke up. His heart racing, the sensation that something was wrong. First, he noticed the cold, a strange chill that seemed to spread through the entire room. Then came the smell. A subtle, almost imperceptible odor of rotten wood and dirty water. And then he saw. The door to the porch was open. Open enough to let the darkness from outside seep in. But he knew he had closed it before going to sleep. Locked. At least that's what he remembered. Trying to keep calm, Lucas slowly got up and walked to the door. The cold floor under his feet, and the unsettling feeling that someone was watching him in the dark. With a swift movement, he shut the door, locked it, and exhaled in relief. But when he looked down, he felt his blood run cold. Footprints. Wet footprints, starting at the porch and ending right beside his bed. Lucas stood frozen, unable to move. He was alone in the house. Or at least he thought he was. Outside, the wind had stopped. The silence was so deep he could hear his own heartbeat. And then, the porch door opened again. This time he didn't move. Something inside him told him not to look, to pretend that nothing was happening. But then he realized there was something in the room with him. He felt it before he saw it. The pressure in the air, the chill emanating from one specific spot. Slowly, he turned his head toward the corner of the room. And there, in the dim light, someone was sitting. It was a dark figure, motionless, simply watching him. Lucas's heart pounded so fiercely he thought he might faint. And then he noticed the most terrifying detail of all. Where the eye should have been on that thing, there was only emptiness. A deep, dark void. And then, the figure stood up. Lucas doesn't remember what happened next. All he recalls is the suffocating feeling, the intensifying cold, and the moment when the lights flickered. When he turned around, the figure was gone. The house was silent. The door remained open. But Lucas knew he was no longer alone in that house. The silence inside the house felt wrong. It wasn't the comforting quiet of the early morning, it was a dense, suffocating silence. As if something were there, waiting. Lucas still stood motionless, his heart hammering in his chest. He blinked a few times, trying to adjust his eyes to the darkness. The figure he had seen had vanished. But he knew that didn't mean it had left. A shiver ran down his spine. The musty, rotten smell still lingered in the air. He looked around, the weak light from the lamp barely illuminated the room. Shadows seemed to move as if the darkness itself were alive. He took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, but then he heard something. A soft sound. A footstep. In the hallway. But he was alone, wasn't he? Lucas forced himself to move. He reached for the cell phone on the bedside table, but the screen was black. The device wouldn't turn on. No light, no signal. Just a dark reflection of his own terrified face. He held his breath. The air now felt even denser, and the silence even deeper. That's when he felt it, the weight on the mattress, as if someone had just sat down beside him. Ambient sound, a faint creak of fabric shifting as if someone had leaned closer. Lucas didn't want to look. Every fiber of his being screamed not to. But human instinct, the need to confirm one's fear, was stronger. He slowly turned his head. And then he saw it, just for a second. The reflection in the glass of the window beside the bed. And in that reflection, he wasn't alone. Pure terror struck him like an electric shock. He leaped out of bed, chest heaving. He looked back, but there was nothing there. Nothing except darkness. Yet he had seen it. He was certain. And at that moment he realized that something in the house was toying with him. Lucas felt panic rising. He wasn't dreaming. This wasn't a nightmare. He needed to get out of that house, immediately. Lucas stood in the middle of the room, his breathing uneven. Terror had taken hold, but he knew he had to leave. No. Every second spent in that house made his chest tighten, as if the air were growing denser, heavier, more ominous. He took a step toward the door, and then, the sound came. He froze. It was a wet, thick sound, as if something were dripping from above. Slowly, he looked up at the ceiling, and what he saw made his mouth dry up instantly. There was a stain, dark, damp, spreading across the ceiling above his bed. It was large, and it was still growing. The liquid trickled in thin streams, slowly descending the wall. And then, a drop fell onto the sheet. Red. Lucas's heart pounded. He didn't want to see it, didn't want to look, but his body moved on its own. With a hesitant motion, he took another step back, until something cracked on the ceiling. Lucas jumped back, his eyes wide. Something had fallen from the ceiling. Something dark, misshapen, damp. A contorted mass. For a brief moment, the weak lamp light revealed skin, wrinkled, bluish, swollen from water. The stench of decay hit Lucas like a punch to the stomach. His entire body screamed to run to escape that house. But then he heard it. The most terrifying sound of all. A snap. The thing began to move. He turned his face, stomach churning, skin breaking into a cold sweat. But there was nothing there. Only darkness. Yet he knew something was there. He could feel the weight of an unseen gaze, the air charged with a presence impossible to ignore. And then, a cold hand touched his shoulder. Without a moment's thought, Lucas ran. Out of the room, down the dark corridor. Every step echoed like thunder inside the house. He didn't know where to go. He just wanted to get out. But when he reached the living room, everything was different. The house no longer looked the same. The sofa wasn't in its usual place. The paintings had changed. And outside the window, the lake no longer reflected the moon. Only emptiness. In that instant, Lucas realized that it wasn't just the house that was wrong. Something had changed. Time, space, reality itself. He was no longer where he thought he was. He didn't know where he was. And the worst was that he was no longer alone. Lucas could barely breathe. The air was heavy, almost solid, as if every breath was a struggle. The living room was no longer the same. He looked around, trying to find something familiar, but everything seemed off. As if he were inside a distorted reflection of the very house. He turned quickly. Nothing. Just the darkness of the corridor behind him. But he knew he had heard something. Someone was there. And then, the clock on the wall stopped. Its hand trembled, and began to move backward. Lucas swallowed hard. His entire body screamed for him to leave. But his feet wouldn't move. As if the floor were holding him, trapping him, sinking, as if the house were closing in around him. He turned toward the front door. He had to get out. No. But when he touched the doorknob, panic struck him like an electric shock. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he looked up. And then he saw. In the corner of the room, near the fireplace, there was someone. No, there was something. A distorted, wet silhouette, with arms unnaturally long, and a head tilted in an impossible way. Its eyes were deep, empty, dark voids. And from its mouth, something was oozing. Lucas felt his stomach churn. The smell. The sound. The invisible weight of that dead gaze upon him. He knew what it was. Somehow, he knew. It was him. His own reflection, but sunk into the lake, drowned, swollen, as if he had been dead for a long time. He blinked, sweat streaming down his forehead. And then, the thing smiled. Lucas stumbled backward, his heart racing. This couldn't be real. It couldn't be. But then, the TV, which he didn't even remember turning on, lit up. On the screen, images wavered. A home video. The focus was the lake at night. Someone was filming from the porch. The camera shook as if the person were nervous. And then, the water stirred. Lucas's eyes widened. He recognized that video. But it was impossible. Had he ever seen it? Or Had he? The camera zoomed in on the lake. The person filming's breathing grew rapid. And then, the thing emerged from the water. Lucas felt his body freeze. The figure in the video was him. He was there, in the video, emerging from the lake, with deep-set eyes and bluish skin, like someone who no longer belonged to this world. His breathing faltered. He tried to back away from the TV, but then, a voice came from the screen. "You have been here before? And you never left." Lucas fell back, gasping. The pieces began to fit together in his mind, though he didn't want to believe it. Fear took over. Panic. The collapse of reality around him. He had never left that house. Lucas remained motionless. The world around him seemed to shrink, the shadows on the walls stretching unnaturally, as if the house were breathing. But he knew it wasn't the house. He looked up, and his heart nearly stopped. The dark stain on the ceiling had grown. Now, it wasn't just a leak. It was a hole. Black, damp, pulsing, and on the other side of it, something was staring at him. Desperation hit him like a shock. He had to run. He had to get out of there. But when he turned to the door, he stopped. His stomach churned. Cold sweat ran down his spine. The door was no longer there. In its place, there was only more wall, as if an exit had never existed. Lucas tried to swallow his panic, tried to run toward the window, but then, something touched his ankle. He screamed, kicking the air, stumbling backward. But there was nothing there. Nothing visible. Only the echo of his own rapid breathing, and the invisible weight of the presence that was now inside him. The image on the TV flickered. The picture trembled. And then, the thing on the video smiled back at him. And it was at that moment that Lucas remembered. He had been there before. He had tried to escape before. But he never succeeded. Because this wasn't an ordinary house. This wasn't an ordinary lake. He wasn't trapped in the house. He was trapped by what came from the lake. And this time, he wasn't alone. Lucas felt his body tremble. Time seemed to melt around him. He tried to move, but something held him back. Not with hands, not with chains, but with memories. The lake, the icy water gripping his skin, the weight pulling him down. The metallic taste of fear mixed with the crushing silence. He had been there before. The truth hit him like a cold blade down his spine. He never got out of the water. He never made it to the house. He never managed to breathe again. But if he was dead, who was seeing through his eyes now? On the screen, a video began. It wasn't showing the lake anymore. Now the camera displayed the very room he was in. The same room. At that exact moment. Someone was filming him. But he was alone. Right. Lucas moved slowly toward the TV. The image wavered, grainy like an old tape. And then, a shadow shifted in the corner of the screen. It was him. And yet it wasn't. It was something using his form. The face had no eyes. Only deep, dark voids. And the mouth was smiling. An impossible smile, stretched from ear to ear, as if the skin had been forced to contort. Lucas recoiled, his breath failing. But inside the TV, the copy of him took a step forward. Then another. And finally, it stepped out of the screen. The room plunged into darkness. Absolute black. The only sound was his own rapid breathing. And then, he felt a cold breath behind his ear. Now it's your turn to be trapped. The cabin by the lake is still there. Intact. Abandoned. A building forgotten by time, but never truly empty. Sometimes, fishermen passing by claim to hear a strange noise coming from the house. Like a TV left on, buzzing in the middle of the night. But when someone approaches, the sound stops. As if it had never been there. Others swear they have seen a silhouette in the window. But when they look again, there's nothing. Or worse. They say that if you press your ear against the door, you can hear someone breathing inside. But don't try to open it. Don't try to enter. Because those who do, never leave the same. Are you still here? Interesting. Or perhaps you can't leave anymore? Before it's too late, leave a like and subscribe. Maybe that will keep you safe. Or perhaps it's already too late.